Welcome to the History IB exam revision video on the Paper 1 topic of Versailles Conference and the Paris Peace Treaties. The syllabus area covered in this video is specifically under Peacemaking and Peacekeeping, International Relations 1918 to 1936. And the 2 points that I'll cover in this video are the aims of the participant and peacemakers, including Wilson and the 14 points, as well as the terms of the Paris Peace Treaties, including Versailles, Germain, Trianon, Neuilly, Sèvres, and Lausanne. So Paris 1919. Before considering the aims of the individual peacemakers, which were the big four primarily, the US, Great Britain, France, and Italy, we need to consider a few complications. So one complication was the strength of the press and the public opinion. The US wasn't that influenced by it, but for example, Great Britain and France, led by George Clemenceau and Lloyd George, they were heavily influenced by the public's desire for revenge on Germany and this demand that they wanted to make Germany pay. So this definitely influenced the goals of these politicians. Furthermore, the Allied during the war promised territory to several countries. For example, Italy in the Treaty of London 1915. Italy were promised territory, for example, South Tyrol from Austria. And so these obviously complicated the process of making a just peace. Moving on to the aims of the participants. France, led by George Clemenceau, as mentioned, they wanted security by weakening Germany. And this security was to take place by weakening Germany financially through heavy reparations to be paid to France and Great Britain. Territorially, by taking away the Rhineland and by giving Alsace-Lorraine back to France. And military, by demilitarizing all of Germany and specifically part of the Rhineland. Also, they wanted Anglo-American military guarantee against German aggression. Let's see what it leads to. Britain, led by David Lloyd George. Germany was to return all territory it had occupied, and an independent Polish state was to be created, and self-government for the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as well as self-determination for the non-Turkish people within the Ottoman Empire. And as I mentioned before, the British public was very keen on making Germany pay. So obviously this influenced David Lloyd George in his peacemaking process. The US, led by Woodrow Wilson, he thought that the purpose of war was to make the world safe for democracy, and therefore the 14 points, which was his proposal for peace, had the objective of preventing future wars by tackling the issues that led to the First World War. And so these key issues were that people should have national self-determination, there should be disarmament, there should be freedom of navigation, meaning freedom of the seas, there should be free trade, and there should be put an end to secret treaties, and instead a League of Nations should be established. We'll cover the League of Nations in a later video. Italy, led by Vittorio Orlando, their main goal was to keep up with the Treaty of London of 1915 that I mentioned earlier. They wanted this territory that they had been promised, even though it ignored national self-determination, which was a big goal of Woodrow Wilson. So the Treaty of London entailed the following territories to Italy: part of Ottoman Empire, a share of Germany's colonies, the Dodecanese Islands, the South Tyrol, and part of Dalmatia. So the terms of the treaties again. So Versailles became a compromise between Wilson's idealism, Clemenceau's desire for security, as well as Lloyd George's desire for reparations and his desire for these plebiscites to be held, meaning that national self-determination would be achieved. Clemenceau was softened a bit in his goals for security because Anglo-American guarantee was actually granted. The US and Great Britain promised France that they would grant this security that in the case of invasion by Germany, for example, they would step in. This was never ratified, however, but it helped to soften the reparation conditions on Germany. The conference was concluded in January 1920, and the treaty with Germany specifically was concluded in June 1919. Final treaties came in a little later, with Hungary in June 1920 and Turkey in August 1920. So let's consider first the Treaty of Versailles. So this was the treaty conducted in regard to Germany, and for many people it was deemed a very, very tough and harsh peace treaty. For example, Germany lost territory to both France, Poland and Denmark. In fact, they lost 13% of the European territory, along with 10% of their overall industrial capacity. All the African, Chinese and Pacific colonies were lost and managed by a system called the Mandate System that we'll cover in a later video. Also, Austria and Germany were forbidden unification, despite many Austrians and Germans in fact wanting this, so kind of against the self-determination principle. Also, Germany had to accept the war guilt, meaning that they accept that they caused the war, and thus they had to pay massive reparations to France and Great Britain, as well as other countries. Finally, there was huge military restrictions imposed on the Germans. Their army was limited to 100,000 men. They weren't allowed an air force, and only a few battleships was allowed. The Rhineland also was occupied by Allied military forces for the next 15 years. And finally, the West bank of the Rhine was to be demilitarized. Okay, so the Treaty of Saint-Germain. This was the treaty in regard to Austria, concluded in September 1919. Similar to the German treaty, Austria had to accept the war guilt and thus pay huge reparations to, for example, France and Great Britain. They also were to limit their armed forces. Austria actually was only allowed 30,000 men in the army. Furthermore, they lost a lot of territory because Italy actually got most of the territory had been promised in the Treaty of London of 1915. Also, a lot of the Austrian territory was awarded to successor states. For example, Dalmatia went to Yugoslavia and Galicia went to Poland. So these territorial changes resulted in a change in population in Austria from 22 million to only 6.5 million. And in fact, most of their former industrial areas were lost. Next up, we have the Treaty of Neuilly, concluded with Bulgaria in November 1919. And similar to Austria and Germany, Bulgaria had to accept the war guilt, and therefore they had to pay reparations and were only allowed an armed force of 20,000 men. Also, they lost territory. The Western Thrace went to Greece, and they lost Aegean colonies, as well as Northern Macedonia going to Yugoslavia and Dobruja to Romania. The treaty with Hungary was concluded in June 1920. It's called the Treaty of Trianon, and it was delayed due to unrest, internal unrest in Hungary. For example, there was an attempted communist coup which was suppressed by some war generals. Anyway, they were to accept war guilt and thus pay huge reparations. And as we've seen earlier, they also were to limit the armed forces. So they were allowed 35,000 men. They lost a lot of territories to successor states like Austria. For example, they lost Slovakia and Ruthenia to Czechoslovakia. They lost Croatia and Slovenia to Yugoslavia, and they lost Burgenland to Austria. The population, just like in Austria, was reduced dramatically from 21 million to 7.5 million, and the majority of their industrial capacity and raw materials were lost. So the last two treaties are Sèvres and Lausanne, both concluded with Turkey. The first one in 1920, which was a strict treaty with big territorial losses and loss of rights, like we've seen with the previous treaties. This treaty was significantly altered in Lausanne, mainly due to the nationalist revolution led by Mustafa Kemal. Kemal and this nationalist movement took command of the Turkish government and took to invade Greece. This invasion was settled through the Treaty of Lausanne. And through this treaty, minorities in Turkey were protected, and the boundaries with Greece and with Bulgaria were settled. And of course, still, Turkey had to let go of some territory, but to a way smaller extent than Sèvres had suggested. So to get a quick overview of the four treaties. Versailles 1919 was concluded with Germany. Saint-Germain 1919 with Austria. Neuilly 1919 Bulgaria. Trianon 1920 with Hungary. And finally Sèvres and Lausanne 1920 and 1923 with Turkey. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe if you enjoy the videos.